of the 30 Years' War. We have Katerina Tkacova, who is one of the researchers on the John Fell funded project, out of which this evening's talk is coming, and who was also a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Politics here at Oxford, and Thomas Pert, who is also a postdoctoral researcher on the project. So without further ado, I will hand over to our first speaker, which I think is Peter, and much to the relief of you all, I will also mute my own microphone.
Right. Okay. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. It's very good to see everybody, so many people here, because we're presenting work in progress, and we'd be very, very grateful for your feedback, because we're still finding our feet with this project. I've got probably the least interesting part of the papers tonight, because I just want to set the scene, and I want to say something about the research context that informs our research, and something about what we're trying to do, and then that will set up what follows. So Tom Pert will then follow me, and he'll be explaining about how we are trying to translate the rather messy empirical data that we have, the historical evidence, into the mapping, and Kate will then talk about the mapping and its potential. But I think probably a few words about the 30 Years' War to start with. Oops. Why is that not working? Yes, here we go. Great. A few words I think are probably necessary. So the conflict known as the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 48, is generally taken as the most destructive conflict in European history before the two world wars of the 20th century. It took at least 60 years or so for the population of the Holy Roman Empire, the war's main battleground, to recover. Economy, society, culture, politics, these were all profoundly affected by the conflict. And the conflict really, the level of destruction has established the conflict as a kind of benchmark by which subsequent conflicts have been measured, not only in Europe, but also elsewhere in the world. The scholarly convention on the conflict by the 19th century had decided that this was the culmination in a cycle of religious wars beginning with the Reformation. This in turn, while this interpretation is obviously contested, this interpretation nonetheless has led to the concluding Peace of Westphalia as being regarded as inaugurating the modern sovereign state system, the modern international order, as it's now enshrined in international law and embedded in international organizations such as the UN. Again, as historians, we might question that, but nonetheless, this is how the war has generally been perceived and how it is embedded in other branches of scholarship. There's a widespread tendency amongst Western commentators in particular to view current conflicts through the assumptions which have been forged by this interpretation of the 30 Years' War. Notably, the wars in Syria and elsewhere in the world seem to exhibit similar structural features as the 30 Years' War, and therefore the suggestion is most recently and extensively put in the volume of Westphalia for the Middle East by Patrick Milton, Michael Axworthy and Brendan Sims, that somehow the solutions to today's problems can be found in the past. So with that focus on the past is one of the things that sort of brought us to the project that we're trying to do. And the research context for this is that historians' ability to contribute to these contemporary debates is constrained by our, as in historians, inability or at least difficulties of interpreting the complex and difficult evidence for the war's impact, and also by the problems of organizing our findings in ways in which can be used by scholars in other fields, as well as, I think, engaging with those who are involved in other areas of historical analysis. The historians who've looked at the 30 Years' War have been very good at doing certain things and not very good at doing others. They've been very good at producing lots of detailed case studies of individual towns and territories, which draw on the often very rich local archival evidence to show how specific populations were affected by the conflict. Unfortunately, they've been a lot less successful at producing macro quantitative assessments, and most of the discussions that do exist rely on the work that you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, a work by the German historian Günther Franz, which first appeared in 1940. And Franz's work is problematic, I mean, not least because of his Nazi sympathies and at the exact point when that book was published, but also his unsystematic compilation of numerous local and regional studies that was his main basis, his main evidence. But there's also a much more fundamental underlying problem behind Franz's book, which is that virtually everyone who's tried to tackle this at a macro level have produced sets of before and after statistics. And there are actual historical archival reasons why that is so. There are lists of damage that contrast the situation immediately after the war with what was thought to have prevailed before 1618. This approach, of course, fails to take account of the changes that had happened in the meantime. This is a very long time span we're talking about, and we're talking about a very expansive area. This is a long and complex conflict. So measuring simple before and after doesn't really help. And unfortunately, I think military historians have also contributed to the difficulties of trying to understand the conflict, because their studies of the war have primarily concentrated on what was known at the time as major war, the major operations which resulted in large battles or sieges. And they've neglected the kind of actions that you can see on this contemporary engraving by Hans Ulrich Flanke on the other side, of raids, of skirmishes, and also of less bloody contact between soldiers and civilians, namely the prolonged occupation of parts of settlements and of communities. And from those micro studies that we have, we can see that that prolonged occupation was often one of the major ways in which the war left a very lasting impact. So when we turn to how this has been mapped, attempts to map the war, the course of the war and the impact of the war reflect these two historiographical traditions that I've just outlined. We have the kind of before and after maps, and these are primarily, as I say, based really on the calculations that Franz did. So showing you the proportion of the population that was lost, varying from supposedly areas of no change, which are shaded in the light pink on the left-hand side of the screen, or yellow on the right-hand side of the screen, to areas where maybe up to half the population had seemingly disappeared. That doesn't take account, of course, of population movements or anything else that's been happening in between. So these maps, I think, are of limited utility. And then those that try to show a dynamic interaction produce these sort of maps, which I call snail's trails. So the one on the left shows the movements of the major anti-Habsburg forces in the first half of the war, and the one on the right is an attempt to try to capture broader movement across the war. And these are, quite frankly, very confusing, and they only really show a very limited aspect of the military operations. They don't show the presence of troops over time. They also don't show the interaction of military operations with physical and human geography, or indeed much really with political geography. So what we're trying to do is to see if we can do a bit better than this. We want to see if we can develop new ways to map the war's impact and also the conduct of the war, so to answer both of those kind of questions. And we're aiming to produce dynamic digital visualizations which can be manipulated in different ways according to the research questions that we and others may have. So I'm going to hand over now to Tom, who will tell us about the difficulties that are in translating that evidence.